I'll talk for just a couple of minutes here, and then we will get started on the tour. Just kind of introduce myself a little bit for those of you folks that don't know me. I was born here in 1970, lived here pretty much my whole life except for about 10 years when I moved to Greenville, and that was the big city for me. So I had to get back to Anderson. I actually lived off Woodruff Road, so if you've been anywhere near there, you know why you want to get out as quick as you can. We're going to talk about a lot of fun things today. Some stuff, well, fun, where I'll talk about people who died. The theme is, as Beth said, is dying young. All the graves that we're going to visit are people or representing people who died pretty young in their lives. We'll talk about some illnesses, a couple of suicides, some murders, some farming accidents, and all kind of interesting things. So the individuals that we're going to talk about, most of them were not city leaders. They weren't politicians. They weren't generals or great figures. They were average, everyday citizens. Yet their deaths were the talk of the town when they happened. And that's something to remember, as we're going to talk about your fellow citizens as we go through this tour. A couple of names you might notice. One of the gentlemen that we'll talk about had a street named after him. Another had a company that was a family business. So you may mention, or you may reference or remember a couple of those. So we'll go ahead and get started. We're going to walk this direction, so if everyone just follow me. We've got about 8 graves we're going to visit, 10 different individuals. 2 of the graves are double graves, so that'll kind of speed us up a little bit as well. So if everyone just follow me this direction, we'll get started with grave number 1. All right, well, everyone, again, greetings. Thank you for the walk. Most of the graves are going to be within this general area here, but we'll start with the grave number 1. This is Clarence Tolly. Now, how many people remember the Tolly name or know the Tolly name from Anderson's history? Okay, the Tolly Furniture Company was one of the many great business firms in Anderson that was family owned for many, many years. It was located where the Albertson Community Theater is today. The building burned many years ago. It was turned into the State Theater, but part of the original store is still standing. The back side of the building, you can still see Furniture Warehouse across the top, and that's where the Tollys had their business. Now, Clarence Tolly died September 1st, 1920. It was his first day back to work after he'd been at the sanitarium at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland for treatment of an unnamed illness. Fortunately, that was his last day at work. He was shot that afternoon by a fellow employee named Hudson Herring. Now, the story goes like this. Hudson Herring had been working for the Tolly Furniture Company for several years as a truck driver. A couple of months before he murdered Clarence Tolly, he noticed some sores on his body and gone to the doctor and said, "What's the deal with these sores?" The doctor examined him and said, "Well, you have a venereal disease." He approached his wife about it, and after several threats and threats against her life, she finally confessed that she had been sleeping with Clarence Tolly, one of the 2 brothers that ran the Tolly Furniture Company. Well, that set Mr. Herring into a rage. He drove up to the front of the Tolly Furniture Company in his truck on September 1st, walked to the front counter, asked for his week's pay, and then resigned. He walked up to the 2nd floor of the Tolly Furniture Company, found Clarence Tolly in his office, pulled out a revolver, and fired 1 shot. Fortunately for Tolly, the shot missed. He ran behind a bookcase trying to hide, didn't do any good. Herring went over, slid the bookcase out of the way, and emptied the revolver. 5 more shots. 3 hit Tolly, 1 was enough to do the job. The gunshots, of course, aroused a lot of interest in the building. People came running toward the sound. By this time, Herring had escaped through the back of the building and ran down toward the Brown grocery store. He hid in the woods and was not found for several hours. He finally turned himself in to the police and confessed to his crimes and relayed the story I just told you. Tolly was buried with his wife's family. These are the Whites. His wife was a White, and you'll notice in the corner a Shriner's emblem. Tolly was a Shriner and was well known in the fraternal communities and organizations in the upstate and in South Carolina. Herring, for his part, was sentenced to 6 years in prison, and he appealed the prison sentence. It was reduced to 3 years, so he perhaps found a sympathetic judge to the situation that he was in. But this is Clarence Tolly, the first of our spot, murdered by a fellow employee. All right, the next one we're going to look at is Anna Mae Murphy. This is the 2nd grave on our stop. Now, it's a small grave. She was a child. She lived about 14 months, didn't accomplish much in her lifetime, could barely walk, could barely talk, but her grave is very significant in the history of Silverbrook Cemetery. She, along with 1 other child, are considered to be the earliest internments in the cemetery. Now, her interment took place on August 25th, 1887. Just 3 months prior, the city had gotten together and decided it was time for the city to have its own municipal cemetery. Prior to that point, burials usually took place on family property or on church grounds or at the cemetery behind First Presbyterian Church, which was technically the city's first public cemetery. When the city was looking for a cemetery, they were trying to pick the right piece of property because everybody knows location is everything when you're trying to do something. And in the space of 30 days, the city put together a committee, took bids, and purchased a piece of property. That's pretty fast moving for any city government. Now, the property that they selected is the property that you're standing on right now. It was owned by a lady named Georgia Ann Brown, who's buried close to the White Street section of the cemetery there. She sold the city the property, 24.9 acres, at the price of $50 an acre. That was not the cheapest bid, but it was the bid that they selected because of the location. Directly behind us is Silverbrook, the body of water that gives the cemetery its name. At the time the city purchased this property, the grounds behind me was a park that was used by many organizations and churches and schools in the city. There was a pavilion, goldfish pond, dancing area, several footbridges across the creek. So it was a very, very popular area for a lot of folks to visit. The city's plan was to turn the cemetery and the park into a multi-use property. People might want to have a church picnic next to where Grandma's buried. Didn't turn out that way. The whole area became a cemetery, and Silverbrook stands as it is today. And Mae Murphy was buried almost 6 months before any plots were sold in the cemetery. So she stood out here quite alone for quite some time. There are older tombstones in the cemetery, so don't be surprised if you see one older than 1887. This is because a lot of folks were moved to Silverbrook from other cemeteries. But her tombstone is significant as being one of the first ones buried here in the cemetery. Her cause of death is somewhat of a mystery. The newspaper simply said it was an illness. Could have been a fever, could have been any number of things. A lot of children died very young at that age. All right, the third grave that we're going to talk about is J. Claude Dixon. Died 1899 at the age of about 33 years old. J. Claude Dixon walked into his house on McDuffie Street early that morning around 5:30, woke his wife up from bed, looked at her and said, "I'm going to kill myself." Put a pistol to the side of his temple, blew his brains out right there in front of her. Previous 24 hours is about all we know of J. Claude Dixon's life. He was a member of the Pioneer Fire Brigade. Now, this was before the city had a municipal fire department. Most neighborhoods had their own fire brigades, and they were given colorful names. They all had costumes, and they would often compete with each other in athletic events, sort of a little mini Olympics for firemen. And J. Claude Dixon was actually at a practice the day before, rehearsing and getting ready for the next big competition they were going to have. After the rehearsal ended and the practice was over, his whereabouts were pretty much unknown. It is believed that he went fishing with a buddy. He returned to Anderson around 4:30 that morning, went to his place of business, which was a small retail store, spoke with a couple of clerks there, left the business, ran into two police officers named O'Donnell and Ray. They spoke with him for a few minutes as well before he returned home. Nobody knows why he did what he did. His wife remarried and is buried somewhere else, so that is why he stands alone in this plot in the cemetery here. But J. Claude Dixon, suicide at the age of 33. All right, the next grave we're going to talk about is the grave of William or Willie Creighton. You might have heard the Creighton name in Anderson's history. It's a well-established name in Anderson. Willie Creighton's grandfather was actually Bayless Creighton, who's buried at the far end of the plot there. Bayless Creighton was a local legislator from Anderson down in Columbia, and he had a large estate about 2 miles west of the city. His estate or his farm was actually being managed by William, his grandson. Now, William was well-liked, very handsome, very robust, and he was considered one of the biggest or most popular eligible bachelors in Anderson. A lot of women liked Willie Creighton. But Willie Creighton had a very serious passion for his grandfather's farm. He loved taking care of it, he loved working it, and he was very good at his job. Unfortunately, he could be a little forgetful at times, and that's what caused his untimely death on July 14th, 1898. Willie Creighton was working with a farmhand on a piece of equipment. Now, the equipment was very unique. Meat was fed into the equipment, it was chopped up into little pieces and then sent out on a conveyor belt. The meat was then used to feed different farm animals. It was not uncommon for the belt to slip on this piece of equipment. It's a very easy problem to fix. You simply turned it off, opened the cylinder, replaced the belt, closed the cylinder, turned the machine back on, and you went about your business. But Willie Creighton forgot to do one thing. He forgot to turn it off. So the belt pops. He's in a hurry. He opens the top of the cylinder. Now, inside the cylinder were lots of spinning blades and knives. Anybody want to guess what happens? Cylinder opens and cylinder blows. Willie Creighton found himself impaled against a barn wall, basically, and died instantly. The farmhand was also severely injured, had to have his leg amputated, and subsequently died as well. Now, Willie Creighton's grave or tombstone is just as interesting as his life. You'll see a lot of these out here in the cemetery. This is a Woodman of the World tombstone. Now, if you don't know who the Woodmen of the World is, it's still a fraternal organization in existence, and it was similar to the Masons or the Elks or those other kind of organizations, with the exception that it offered a unique function, and that was an insurance policy. Members of the Woodmen of the World were able to take advantage of a pretty good insurance policy. They also received a free tombstone when they died. And some of these tombstones are fairly elaborate. And this policy right here almost bankrupted the organization because nobody thought it would be expensive to do all these tombstones. But if you see a tombstone like this, that's a tree or a series of logs, it's going to be a Woodman of the World tombstone. If you look around the cemetery, you'll see quite a few of them. The Creighton family is still around in Anderson, still a great family, but poor Willie just forgot to turn the machine off. All right, if you've lived in Anderson any length of time, you probably recognize the last name on this tombstone. It's the name of a major street in Anderson. It's Murray Avenue, and this is the person that Murray Avenue was named for, Edwards Bobo Murray. Now, if Anderson ever had a golden boy, it was Edwards Bobo Murray. At the age of 15, actually he was born in Newberry County, let me start over there, to J. Scott Murray, who was a reverend and a well-noted attorney. A lot of times ministers couldn't make a lot of money as a minister, so they would have other occupations. A lot of them were doctors, physicians, and attorneys, and J. Scott Murray was a very noted attorney in Newberry. He moved to Anderson when Edwards was very young, and this was his home pretty much the rest of his life. At the age of 15, Edwards Bobo Murray was accepted into Furman University. At the age of 17, he attended the University of Virginia. Unfortunately, he was not able to complete his education because of an illness. He returned home and became employed by his father studying law at his father's office. At the age of 20, the General Assembly in Columbia passed a special bill allowing Edwards Murray to become an attorney without graduating from law school. His mind was so sharp, and for the rest of his life, he was one of the most noted attorneys not only in South Carolina but in the Southeast. He argued cases at state courts, local courts, circuit courts, and even in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Edwards Bobo Murray had a family, and his property was located behind Chapman Tire there on Murray Avenue. The house has been long gone. On the property was a pond, and Murray loved to swim in his pond. He was a very avid swimmer. The day that Murray died, July 7, 1894, he had been walking down the streets of Anderson, visiting his family, visiting friends and business acquaintances, completing whatever businesses he had to do that day, and he returned home. His daughters were there and a couple of their girlfriends as well, and they all decided to go swimming. A couple of the girls couldn't swim very well, and Edwards was giving them lessons, teaching them how to swim, making sure they knew what to do in the water and how to be safe. The girls all returned to shore, and they turned around and yelled for Mr. Murray, "Are you going to come to shore?" He said, "Yes, I'll be there in a moment." Within 10 seconds, he was gone. His feet had gotten caught in the grass underneath the water, and no matter how avid a swimmer he was and how good he was, he simply could not pull himself up out of the water. The girls, for their part, did their best to save him, but unfortunately, due to the fashions at the time, girls were wearing what were called gossamers over their bathing suits, these long, flowy robes that limited their movement in the water, so they unfortunately were not able to get out to save their father. Two of the girls did run into town, but by the time people arrived, the body was retrieved, and Anderson's golden boy was dead. The obituaries, the notices in the paper, the memorials to him when printed out run over 36 pages. So this was someone who, had he lived, would have had a notable impact on Anderson County. He was involved a little bit in politics. He favored Wade Hampton during that period. He was not a fan of Benjamin Tillman, and in his few attempts to run for office, he saw himself defeated by Tillman and his associates many, many times. And at that point, he basically gave up and figured, I'll just be an attorney. I can do more good that way. But Edwards Murray died at the age of 40 due to a drowning accident on his own property, and when you're driving down Murray Avenue today, you're going right through the property that he owned. All right, we've already had one suicide on today's tour, and here is the second, Ulysses Seebut. Probably never heard of his name, but you've all seen his house. If you're leaving Anderson headed toward Belton, look to your right and you'll see it on top of a large hill. It's called Valley View. Seebut built the house in around 1913, 1914. He was a very successful businessman in Anderson, and he was a pioneer in employee rights. He staffed his store with women. He believed that women were better at selling clothes to women than men. Women would be more comfortable talking to a woman about what she wanted, and he was right. He had one of the most successful millinery firms in the city of Anderson. He also had a large mail order business. He was shipping garments and fabrics and clothing to 6 states in the Southeast. So a very successful businessman. But he was pretty poor at managing his own money. He built this large estate, which was approximately 40 acres at the time, built a large house, and his son was in school. On the morning of January 4th, 1915, he returned home after some hours at the office. He got in an argument with his wife and his son about whether or not they could afford to send the son back to college. Seebut looked at both of them and said, "I've had it, I'm done," walked to the desk, pulled out a gun, shot himself in the head. His son tried to stop him, but unfortunately was not able to. Of course, it was ruled a suicide. The Seebuts left the house shortly thereafter. It was put into a receivership and run by a farmer. His legs were burned in an accident in one of the fields behind the house. It was then sold to the McGowan family, and the McGowans lost a son within 30 days of living in the house due to an electrical fire. So you have three pretty bad tragedies with three subsequent owners of the house. It was later bought by the Taylors. Many of you know it as the Taylor House, but the original name of the property was Valley View, and it was built by Ulysses Seebut. Now, he is buried in the plot of his family, or his wife's family, the Watsons. Many times that would happen if a husband would die some way or did not have a plot, they'd be buried with other members of the family. But this is Seebut's grave. One thing to tell you about he and his wife's grave and the other two in the property, these were considered sort of flower bed type graves. The initial plan with these graves was for you to blade them out and then plant flowers or grass so they would grow over the graves and create a mound for the individual buried underneath. You don't see that a lot because obviously it takes time and energy and effort for a lot of the families to do that, and many of them just don't have the time or want to take the upkeep to do them. But that's how these graves here were originally designed and what they were designed for. All right, this is the first of the double graves we're going to look at. You'll notice that they're small, which indicates children. Usually there'll be a lamb inscribed on them as well. There are a couple of children sections to Old Silverbrook. There's one over in this area behind us. There's one over behind there. But you'll also find children's graves throughout the cemetery buried in family plots. This is the Conwell family plot. And the Conwells were unfortunate enough to lose two of their children, both to tragic accidents. The first was Drew. She was a young girl, about 2.5 years of age. They were visiting, the Conwells were, a family that they knew on Orr Street, or in the Orr Mill Village area. Drew was crawling along the front porch, reached up to grab a piece of fabric hanging off the table. What she or no one else knew or realized at the time was there was a heavy crate on top of that piece of fabric. So as Drew pulled on it, the crate slowly slid closer and closer to the edge of the table. After enough pulling, the crate fell off the table. It hit little Drew on her nose, cracked her nose completely off, and crushed her skull. She remained unconscious for about 4 hours and subsequently passed away. A few years later, her brother Thomas was also injured in a very bad accident. And this was the responsibility or the fault of his brother Homer. Homer and his brother were walking in the woods west of Anderson doing some hunting. He had thought he'd emptied his gun of all the shell that was in it, but carelessly pointed it at his younger brother as he was in front of him and pulled the trigger. What shells were remaining in the gun entered Thomas's back, shattering his spine and breaking his hip. Unfortunately, Thomas was not as lucky as his sister. He remained conscious for about 6 more hours before he finally passed away. The Conwell children are both buried in this double grave here. And like I said, you'll know that a lot of children's graves, when you see them, there are certain symbolisms on them. The lambs, the size of the graves, and things like that will indicate that there are children that were buried there. But the rest of the Conwell family is all buried here. Homer is not. He is buried somewhere else. Actually, he did not remain in Anderson. He is buried outside of Anderson. All right, the last grave we're going to talk about is a double grave. It's a very unique double grave. Many times you'll see husbands and wives sharing a tombstone or siblings sharing a tombstone. What we have here is a father and a daughter. W.V. Beasley is the father. Emma Beasley Hyde is his daughter. And they were both murdered by Emma's husband. Hyde is an appropriate last name considering the severity of the crime that he committed. Hyde and Emma had been married for quite some time, a little over 1.5 years, but the marriage was never a good marriage. And Emma had finally decided she'd had enough and was separating from her husband. She was staying with her father at a friend's house, again in the Orr Mill area. And Samuel Hyde, the son-in-law, staked out the house for several weeks. He studied the movements of the people in the house. He noticed when they went to bed. He knew who visited. He knew when the lights were out. On the early morning hours of January 11, 1911, Samuel Hyde entered the house through an unlocked back door. He walked to the bedroom where the father and the daughter were asleep in bed, pulled out a pistol and opened fire. Neither one woke up to the sounds of the gunfire. They both died instantly, but the gunshots were so close to the bed clothing that their bodies were burned almost beyond recognition before they were able to put them out. Such was his hatred for his wife. Samuel Hyde readily confessed to his crimes. As a matter of fact, he was very happy about what he did. He was proud of what he did, and he bragged to everybody that the plan turned out exactly as he wanted it to be. He waited for his hanging, and he was subsequently hung for the double murder in Anderson. That is the tour of Old Silverbrook and the folks we're going to talk about that died young. I want to thank you on behalf of myself, Beth Batson, everybody with the city, for taking time out of your day to come down and listen to me tell some stories. As you walk through the cemetery, pick out a grave, write the date down, go research that individual, and find out about the lives of the people who have woven together to create the fabric of Anderson and the city that we call home. Again, thank you from the bottom of my heart. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your interest.